Ready? Cool. Architects for Urbanity is a design and research office based in Rotterdam who looks at cultural and mixed use buildings as objects that are thoughtfully woven in the context of a city or urbanism. Since founded in 2015 and is now led by Irgen Salianji and Karolina Shushkevich, Architects for Urbanity has been internationally recognized and awarded for their constant analyzing of architecture and urban practices through a wide range of expertise. I am now joined by Ergen, and we are going to converse about critical urbanity in practice. So it'll be around the topics of integrated city, urban typologies, and about how cities are changing and will change in the future. So it should be a fun topic to follow. So thanks so much, Ergen, for hopping on the call.
Thank you very much, Karina, for having me in the design story. I'll be very happy to discuss with you the topics you mentioned. Um, as you said, we are a young international office, and basically we try to work on a kind of holistic approach to the city and architecture. So that's why we insist on the notion of urbanity, which through our research turns out to be the main notion in which people used to refer to the city before the industrial revolution. And then since then the cities grow a lot, and they became more kind of a market instrument. And in that sense, let's say we are talking about fragments of the city nowadays, and we don't have a kind of complete vision of where our cities are heading. So we try to kind of work on that topic. So therefore kind of creating architecture, let's say, with urban qualities. And basically through our research, let's say, we try to extend more on the context and on the wider, let's say, issues that have impact in architecture, let's say. And we are trying to do that in with several ways. Let's say we do a lot of competitions, which basically for us gives, let's say, freedom in the way that we think, and we prepare, let's say, our ideas and our proposals, which is not always the case with commissions, where you have to respond more strictly, let's say, into the kind of the client demands. We're also doing several commissions at this moment. We're collaborating with the office City Foster here in Rotterdam, and we are doing 3 commissions in Albania, which is also very interesting because Albania used to be a very close country during the communist regime, let's say, and since the 90s, its main aim has been to integrate in Europe and to integrate into the global scene, let's say, although it's a small country. And 2 of these projects are hotel projects in the city of Tours. One of them, we call it Sphinx Lofts, is basically an attempt to reconsider how we design, let's say, hospitality projects, and basically rethink the way that we design facades. In that sense, we have kind of created a sort of a fragmented facade, which creates kind of communal diagonal connections between the balconies. And so basically not approaching a project as an aesthetical, let's say, especially when it comes to hotels, as an aesthetical kind of task,
Right.
but basically generating aesthetics through a kind of different thinking about the facade entirely. And then we are also working on a second hotel project in the same city. We're basically kind of trying to create a sort of fragmented facade again, because we have a very big kind of solid object, which kind of let's say imposes itself in the context, and then by kind of fragmenting the facade and the views, we kind of create a more sort of smaller scale, let's say, into the facade.
Nice. So, based on your research, analysis, and the many competitions you've partaken in, how do you see cities changing these days?
Yeah, I think this is the most important topic I think that architects should be considered with concerned with because I think the pace in which the cities are kind of changing and transforming the last decades, let's say, or nowadays is much faster than it used to be. And I think the main kind of components of this transformation of the cities, especially the Western cities, um, would be, for example, our tendency to create more accessible cities. So, for example, accessibility, which basically means mostly the transition from the car to pedestrians. I think that's an important kind of topic. For example, Young Gale and other kind of urban theories have really uh, put that topic forward, not only in theory but also in praxis. So we have cities like Copenhagen or here in Netherlands as well, Rotterdam, where cycling, for example, has become a dominant mode of transportation together with public transport. And I think in that kind of package for the cities is also the notion of circularity, which is very important. So we don't have to own our own car or our basically we are transitioning from the kind of possession-based society into a kind of efficient society where we basically can share the means of transport. And I think that also kind of uh, gives a pass to the notion of the healthy city, right? So if we understand the city as a kind of living organism, then the lungs of the city, uh, uh, it's a very important organ in that sense. I think that's why we see more and more kind of greenification projects. Cities are trying to become greener and healthier, and basically by reducing the amount of cars, the use of cars and the emissions, and therefore kind to create a more kind of healthy and green city. But at the same time, I think there are also other aspects which are not necessarily that positive in the change of the city, as for example, the notion of marketability. So nowadays, I think mayors have become more prominent figures in how cities are run, and I think the main kind of desire in terms from the mayors have been to create more and more kind of icons in the city, right? So like sort of every city nowadays need a star architect to kind of bring it in the scene and make it more marketable and more visitable. And let's say in that kind of context, another huge blow, or not necessarily a negative blow, I would say mostly a kind of positive, is the social media, right? So basically, social media nowadays have become almost a parallel city, right? So which has both positive and negative effects in terms of marketability. Of course, let's say cities have to be more Instagrammable and more sort of fancy, let's say. And in terms of on the positive aspect, let's say we have seen a lot of events and a lot of happenings in the city, kind of driven through social media, like protests or other sort of mass events, let's say. In that sense, it's easier for us to kind of organize mass events and easier to communicate and also navigate through the city, right?
Right. I really like how you see it as a whole system. You know, you said it's a city package where it's all integrated from the programs, the marketing, and how everything's designed and carried out. So, can you maybe give an example of what an integrated city looks like or what elements go into it?
Yeah, I think uh, I think we have tried to kind of come up with such proposal, let's say, so to kind of uh, do urban design or work on a bigger scale while kind of trying to incorporate those components or at least react to those changes, right? So uh, I think I could say that, for example, in our latest projects, for example, the Varna Library, it's a competition we won in 2015 for a very big public building in the city of Varna in Bulgaria. Uh, we basically try to kind of create a building, public building that is part of an extension of the urban realm, right? So in that sense, we try to investigate ways in which the form of the building would kind of work as an extension of the city. So basically, how the city penetrates the building, the institution, and vice versa, like how the institution can open up into the city. In that case, we worked with the notion of, let's say, interior urbanism or interior
Mm.
landscape. Landscape not in the sense of greenery, but in the sense of topography. So basically, not thinking of a project of a building as a series of stacked slabs, which are kind of vertically connected with a stair and elevator, but more as a sort of landscape that opens up gradually and kind of connects all the floors and all the functions in a more kind of fluid and continuous manner. And we a similar attempt with I can mention another attempt for the library in Gwangju, a competition we did recently, in which we try to take this step a bit further and basically make almost the whole of the building as a kind of stepped and inclined sort of sequence of situations, in which again, let's say, it fits the library as well because it's a very public, let's say, institution on the one hand, but it's also usually a boring, let's say, function, or at least a slow function. But of course, as the society is progressing, the libraries have been, let's say, the bigger, have been on the receiving end of this transformation, right? So
Mm.
it's a very difficult task nowadays to design a library because you may run the risk that it will be obsolete already by the time it is
Right,
constructed. And so
right,
in that attempt, we try to understand it not anymore as this kind of container of knowledge, but more as a kind of a kind of small city in itself, in which basically you go into the library not only to read books or to let's say pursue knowledge, but mostly to kind of exchange knowledge, create encounters, and basically feel as part of a community in that sense.
right. I guess that's smart, because learning doesn't only happen from reading, right? But it also happens from interacting with other people, from being involved in some activities. But what I'm curious about is when you integrate the public buildings into the landscape, I'm assuming the effect is also psychological to the people. Maybe one of the more obvious one would be where people will feel more welcome and they're not scared to go in, or how is it like?
Yeah, I think that's a key, right? I think public buildings, it's basically our biggest preoccupation and our biggest interest, let's say, uh, have to be fun and have to be kind of leading the example in that sense. So following this sort of transformation, so basically you're right. People have to be invited. So buildings have to be inviting, and I think as the kind of functions fuse and merge one into the other, let's say the buildings have to be less of buildings and they have to be more of, let's say, containers of life. There is a famous Greek architect called Aris Constantinidis, and he was the most critical architect you may ever encounter or study. And he was talking indeed about the notion of the container of life, right? So I think this old modern, and he was a modernist architect. So I think this old modernist sort of idea has a new ground to express itself, right? Because it's what you say. Buildings and projects have to be part of the digital realm, and in terms of physical realm, create more than just satisfy functions and needs, but basically proactively generate situations and encounters.
I see. Well, so I had initially wanted to ask you about what are the main drivers of urban design, right? But Now I'm thinking, is it the case where people insinuate the change? Or is it the other way around, where urban design encourages certain behavior in people?
I think that it used to be that urban design was first, and then people were adapting. I think in the past, I think there was a notion of urbanization that kind of characterized the world due to the factories and the sort of series of events in our kind of human, let's say, development that kind of created the necessity to have cities, right? And then urban design would be on the front line, kind of creating new cities and new neighborhoods and kind of
Right.
creating the conditions for life. But I think more and more nowadays it's indeed the inverted condition, the opposite. I think today with the speed in which everything is communicated and with the ease that we have from technological, I think that yeah, I think that we have another historic moment with the technological kind of revolution, right? Uh, I think urban design is really slow to be able to respond into those society and market needs, I would say. So I think today um, I would say that it's more people and the market and the tech revolution that impose those changes into the cities. And as architects and urban planners, we are constantly struggling to be relevant and to be proactively impactful, let's say, in our work. Which is not necessarily a negative thing. I think maybe we have to just reconsider the way that we do urbanism and urban planning and be more useful, but by being faster and having a more immediate, let's say, impact.
Well, yeah, the pandemic, though, kind of speeds up everything. So, what do you think are the short and the long term effects of the pandemic
Hmm.
on urbanism?
Um, I think that the first, let's say, the first impact is the shock that we received, right? Especially the city. The very foundation of the city is, or if we refer to the writings of Rem Koolhaas, for example, in his study of New York, the city, let's say, was always celebrating the culture of congestion, right? So it was a sort of dense condition
Right.
of coexisting and living and working at the same time, and that is a very thing that we cannot do in the condition of the pandemic, which I think is an interesting shock because the world will never be the same, let's say, after the pandemic, not necessarily in a bad way. So I think indeed the long-term effects will be more important than the short-term problems that we are facing nowadays. But for example, I think the office space would be never the same, will never be the same, because
Right.
indeed for this kind of necessity of working remotely, we actually got used to the tools that we already had, right? So working from teleworking and telecommunicating. So I think I think that the city will be less. We may see an inverted urbanization. So the need that brought us into the cities is now becoming a reason that we may actually leave the city, right? If we don't have to physically be in the city, why would we? Uh, I, I think not everybody would leave the city, of course, because uh, there are more about the city than just functionality, right? It's more fun
Right.
uh, for more introverted people or people that like this kind of culture of congestion. But I think the office space, for example, will be completely changed, and uh, I think the office space would be more and more a place to meet and let's say enjoy with the colleagues and contemplate and come together rather than just a standard place where you perform your work, right?
Yeah, so I guess it's just a time where we can explore a lot more things then. And in the same manner, what do you think are new urban typologies that we can maybe explore and experiment with?
Um, Recently, we in 2017 we participate in the Europan, for example, and we worked on the city of Amsterdam in the neighborhood called Sluisburg. Um, I could see this as an example of our attempts to kind of face this new urban reality. In that project, we kind of the topic was a productive city, right? So I think it's even more relevant now to kind of understand productivity in a sort of more universal way. And what we try to do is basically blend the housing and working. So basically, kind of include a module of working in between the housing. So basically, people would kind of it's another way to avoid commuting, right? So if your
Right.
workspace is very close to your house and there is no pandemic, you would prefer to work uh, uh, in a physical space where you can interact with other people, unless you avoid unless you don't have to commute, for example. Because I think commuting is one of the issues that we can avoid now. Produce a lot of
Yeah,
emissions and a lot of time waste.
highly inefficient. Yeah.
Exactly. So in that case, we try to kind of combine housing and working into the same kind of environment of the neighborhood. Um, we also recently participated in an exhibition in Rome, which was posing the question of history. So, what do you do in historical cities? How can historical cities kind of evolve? Um, uh, Here in Europe, there are many cities that are actually museums of itself, right? There is so much history all over the city that basically you have hardly any opportunity to intervene with something new. And there we proposed what we called the rack of the future, which we understand as a sort of kind of addition of new program on top of the historic one, by using a kind of very light and temporary and modular. So in the sense that you can disassemble it, can be also temporary kind of extension on top of the historic city, in which basically modules would come by drones, and so basically this extension would grow vertically very fast, because basically the main problem with historic cities is the fact that the ground floor is occupied by history, and the ground floor, the street level, is basically the city itself. I think very often when we're trying to think about vertical cities and skyscrapers, we neglect the fact that there is not much urbanity happening uh, above the urban level, the street
Right.
level.
That's true. Yeah.
So basically, in this proposal, we try to work to go higher, but they kind of keep some diagonal connections with the street level. So basically, from the street level, you could in an external condition move three-dimensionally.
Nice. So that's how you highlight a city's identity, right? And in your example, it was about injecting today's world, so urbanism, into such a historic city. So what about in other settings? So maybe if you have an example of highlighting an identity of a rural or an already urban environment.
I think that's a good point in the sense that um, I think as society kind of evolves, identities kind of merge and become more of the same. So, in that sense, I think the question of identity is still relevant. Yeah, we don't necessarily want to be deprived of what makes us special, right? So that's in the end, identity is something that characterizes you and kind of distinguishes you, hopefully in a positive way from the rest. So in that sense, I think cities, I would say that have lost the sources of identity that used to be there, like nationality or local contexts, but that they can still enhance their own identity in other means, right? So in this globalized world, you don't have to be distinguished as being, let's say, Dutch or European, but you can be characterized by being very dynamic or very engaging or very sensible. In that sense,
Mm.
I think we see the most potential to kind of define identity when we, for example, do small scale urban projects. So squares or public spaces. I think that's a nice moment to kind of question what is worth giving identity to the public space. And for example, I could mention our proposal for the main square in Warsaw. Um, a city that has been basically uh, identified by the kind of socialist urban thinking, like very loose kind of. So in that case, we basically try to create a patchwork of different uses because it's the main square, right? So it could be the square that kind of characterizes the whole city, and it's a blank canvas in the sense that the identity of socialism is not was basically alienating, was against density, and in that sense we felt that we could propose a more kind of dense, all-involving public space that can, in that sense, invite all residents of the city and be inhabited creatively, let's say. Or similarly, in a public space, we designed for Bratislava. It's basically a satellite town of Prague in Czech Republic.
Mm.
We had kind of similar task to design a big square, main square, but in that sense, in that occasion, we understood that we are not in an urban context. We are rather in a rural context, in a small town. So what we actually try to do in that project is basically give a strong identity by means of design, but in a very simple way. We kind of draw a sort of square, literally a square of urban pavement, which was then surrounded by trees and landscape around it. So basically, kind of defining where the urban sort of um, uh, place would be to do more bigger events. So the what we expect an open place, but basically restricting that into the amount that this town can support, right? So you don't need a huge open space if you cannot fill it. But maybe in that case, it would be more important to have a more human green sort of surrounding around it, in which let's say you would use more for everyday life, and then you would have the urban open space for bigger public events that happens once in a while, let's say.
I guess no two cities are the same. So, again, I guess we can close with what is your vision of what cities might look like in the future?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting discussion. The future of the cities. I think given the pace of the transformation of the cities, I think it would be almost impossible to predict what's the future. But I find it very interesting the shift towards the countryside, right? So it's not only because of the pandemic, but the pandemic adds on the discussion of the countryside. And I have here the latest publication of Rem Koolhaas, Countryside a Report, which basically I think is a very interesting topic because Koolhaas has been kind of advocating the cities in the last 40 years very successfully and very rightfully so. And he's nowadays kind of shifting the attention towards the countryside. However, I think the countryside is not, or the attention towards the countryside nowadays is not so much focusing on the human element, which was the case with the cities when they appeared, but more on the technological aspect. So the whole study kind of talks about the new industrialization of the landscape, of the countryside, which basically comprises at a large degree to data centers and all these gigafactories. So all these huge buildings that actually have uh, no people inhabiting them, so that very few people are just maintaining them. So a sort of architecture without people. And the other aspect of the focus to the countryside is of course agricultural, new ways to cultivate big amounts of food, let's say, very efficiently, which is another way, another effect that doesn't include people. So in that sense, yes, you can find a lot of innovation in the countryside. Maybe today more innovation happens in the countryside than in the cities. You don't find people in that innovation, which is a kind of question mark, I would say. Is the future of humanity the countryside? Maybe not. But then what happens with our cities? I think that brings us into the same terrain, the city.
Yeah. I guess we're already seeing a lot of satellite cities being developed these days too, right? But although I think it's great to keep advancing in technology and in automation, I also hope that we're not losing touch with, the more human side of things, so that we can still be close to the things that originally made us, such as nature, people, and even our history. So I hope that the future would be finding that balance.
Maybe
What about?
as a side note, I would like to maybe mention the new Babylon of Constant. I'm not sure if you are aware of this thinker of the 70s. Basically, Constant was imagining a city that was inhabited by the playful person. He called it. So he was imagining a future in which people would not have to work, and they would just travel around cities around the world, and therefore he imagined cities that would kind of provide for that. And I think back then it seemed kind of senseless,
Strange.
or but nowadays I think it's becoming the case, right? It's because the main effect of the whole kind of network and of internet and is the fact that you can work from everywhere for most of the professions. I think that will be the case for maybe all of the professions in the future, and therefore the city maybe it's not a permanent kind of receiver of inhabitants, but maybe some sort of a hostel or a hotel. So basically, in that sense, would be even more fun to see how the cities evolve, because they will be mostly trying to satisfy our human needs for interaction and entertainment in that sense.
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Ergen, for sharing today and for such an interesting conversation. Keep doing great things and hope to connect again in the future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.